Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is October the 22nd, 2018, and this is podcast number 21. Once again, I am happy to have you back with us this week. We are still debating the concept of a thought. We are still debating the mystery of a thought. But this week, we're going to delve a little bit in the characteristics of a thought. We are going to examine what makes a thought a thought. How do we decide what a thought is? Now, this is a complicated concept, so this podcast does not necessarily provide answers, but it is a way to get the debate going. It is a way to keep the conversation going. So we are going to sort of decipher a little bit, what makes a thought so hard to determine, why the human mind is somewhat such a mystery in terms of how the function of the mind could be understood. So the concept of a thought is not something that is easily explained. And one of the reasons why it is not easy to explain, it is because there is no consensus as to what the human mind is capable of doing or what human minds are capable of doing. So it is going to be that way because we tend to see the mind differently. And that's why, there's no common ground as to what a thought is. But here I propose to examine the concept from an ontological standpoint. I propose to examine the issue from a philosophical standpoint. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. What are the characteristics of a thought? When we speak about human thought, what is it that we are talking about? How do we discern, how do we decipher the nature of a thought? Now, this is a very difficult question to answer. And one of the reasons this question is difficult to answer, it is because human thinking itself is not well understood. So it is not surprising that understanding, at least speaking about a human thought, is somewhat a speculative undertaking. Talking about the characteristics of a thought, it is almost like playing a guessing game, okay? So you are trying to understand the nature of a function that is somewhat familiar to you, since as a person you have the capacity, at least you can function in that way. But there's absolutely no way to tell whether another or someone else has a similar capacity, whether somebody else can see or think the same way that you do. And there is no way to come up with an objective assessment of what a thought is or what a thought could be. So in other words, what amounts to a thought is not easy to decipher. What amounts to a thought is not easy to explain. So what we know about human thinking abilities is often based on speculations, educated guesses, understandings about how the brain functions anatomically or perhaps psychologically. but we do not have any definitive proof as to what a thought is, at least from an ontological standpoint, at least from a philosophical standpoint. We do not know with certainty what the human thinking function is, or the function of the human mind, what it is. While I agree that the brain and other organs seemingly play an important role in the thinking abilities of a person, I think other things, other entities are interacting in a way that facilitate the being to become aware of the self. Remember, in the previous podcast, we talked about a thought as a conversation that the being is having with the self. And we also talked about the degree to which the being becomes aware of the self and the entities that are within the environment. That awareness in and of itself is what creates or what leads the being to be questioning the self, talking about the self, conversing about the self, hence a thought. So in that sense, when we're talking about the characteristics of the brain, the characteristics of a thought, we have to take into account the fact that the brain by itself is not the only entity that could explain a thought. So by that understanding, other entities within the environment, other entities within the body probably play a role in a thought. Because if we're going to look at the thought as a conversation, that conversation must be taking place between two or more entities. So by that logic, the brain by itself could not amount to the sum of the function of human brain, the sum of the thinking could not account for a thought as a whole. So there ought to be other entities, and those entities could be best examined from an ontological standpoint, from a philosophical lens. Now, we have to understand that I am not trying to debunk medical advances, other scientific advances in terms of how the human body works, at least anatomically. This is not what the purpose of this podcast is. At least this conversation we're having is. That is not what I am trying to do here. What I am trying to do is to try to understand the nature of a thought, the nature of a human thinking beyond the anatomical arrangements of the brain or of the body itself. Because the human thinking abilities have something deeper than the function or the anatomic or the physiology of the body. There is something else going on. That is why consciousness could not be explained physiologically. Consciousness could not be explained anatomically. There is something else going on. There's something else happening, occurring within the body itself that facilitates, that allows the person, the human being, to be conscious, to be aware of the self in the world. Now, we could try to decipher the mechanism of that awareness. We could try to explain it in different terms. As I said in the previous podcast, we could look at it from a psychological standpoint. We could examine it from a biological standpoint, from an anatomical standpoint. We could even examine it from a physiological standpoint. But here the goal is to look at it from a philosophical standpoint. What induces the person? What induces the human being to think? Now, I have to admit that there is no consensus as to what a thought is. So I strongly encourage you to take the ideas that I am trying to vinculate here with a grain of salt. Our understanding about the subject of a human brain is not well understood. It is not settled. So there are diverging views. There are controversies, if you will. But as I sought to explain here thus far, the characteristics of a human thought are not easy to decipher. The characteristics of a human thinking abilities are not easy to decipher. So the intricacies of the human thought itself are difficult to explain. And because of the complexity that makes the thinking process itself, the being is not aware, or is not always able to cater a full grasp of what's happening. In other words, the person, the being, is not necessarily able to explain to you what is happening. The being cannot, because there's so many things happening. There are so many views or understandings about what's occurring in the mind that even the being himself is somewhat uncertain about what's occurring, what's happening. What is certain is that human beings do not seek to think. It is not a function that the person says, I am going to do it. It occurs automatically. It is somewhat an automated function. In other words, human beings do not get out of their way to think. They just do. The question is why that is the case. Now, as I will debate in subsequent podcast, the idea of a human thinking abilities could be understood based on what I coin an automatic dexterity in every human being or in every living being. So one does not learn to think. One does not decide when and how to think or what to think about. It is not up to one to stop thinking at a particular time. Thinking is an ongoing process, it's a continuous process. The being is always thinking. And that always thinking is what catapults the being to be. Because the moment the being stops thinking, the being stops existing. So thinking by itself is an indication of awareness, which by itself is an indication of existence, of survival. As the being thinks, the being is aware of the self, is aware of everything around the self, thereby the being is alive. The being is conscious, and that state of consciousness is what allows the being to understand his place within everything else around him. So I guess what I am saying is that a person cannot prevent himself from producing thoughts. Now the question is, how could we decipher the nature of the thinking instrumentality itself? And this is where the lines are